Loving Lord, we want to thank you for Robert. We want to thank you for your word. And we ask that as Robert expands on the word and brings your word to us, that you will speak your words through him, that you will take away anything that's not of you and make sure that he speaks your words and that those words go into our hearts and minds. Amen.
Good morning. Right, fantastic first slide. Good, thank you, Amy. Now, I'm talking about, it's up here, Practising the Way, the great enemy of spiritual life. And we've been following the series Practising the Way, as you know, over the last 8 weeks, 9 weeks or so. And we sort of come to the end of that course, and this is like the concluding talk, I understand, from that course. And so I'm drawing upon the course. I'm also drawing upon this book, also by John Mark Comer. He was the guy who did Practising the Way. This is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's a very, very good book. This is actually Claire's one. She kindly lent it to me. So I'm drawing upon John Mark Comer's thoughts and his book for inspiration for my talk. In other words, if you like it, thank him. If you don't like it, then it's probably my fault. Now, we live in a challenge of a modern world, digital technology. Don't we all love these? Yes and no, yes. And because we live in a world that actually makes us rush around. I mean, hands up if you, no, don't put your hands up. If you weren't here on time this morning, well, I was here late. I should have been here at 9 o'clock for prayer, and I was half an hour late. I was half an hour late for prayer, okay? And I know others struggle to get here on time, not pointing fingers at anybody. And we also feel under pressure to get jobs done. So we're living in a fairly rushed, sometimes the rushing can be of our own generation, but we live in a rushed world. And the aim of my talk really is to help us to see that following Jesus is not meant to be a rush. It's not meant to be a hard slog. It's not meant to be difficult following Jesus. Jesus spoke about his burden was light. At times, following Jesus is challenging, because often we have to change the way we do things, but it's not meant to be a struggle. It's meant to be a light burden. And particularly when we align the way that we do things with the way that Jesus did things, then we find that actually being a follower or an apprentice or a disciple of Jesus, choose which one you think you are, then we actually find that it's actually not that much of an onerous task. It's not meant to be an onerous task being a Christian. It's a challenge at times. But we have to base the way we live on that modelled by Jesus. So what did Jesus actually say? Let's have a look at the next one. Over there. Yes. Oh, it is turned on. Amy, could you pop on the next slide? Thank you. Right. What did Jesus say in this passage? What does he mean when he says weary and burdened? Well, remember, he was talking to first century Jews living under Roman rule and under the scriptural authority of Jewish scholars like the Pharisees. And as so often, Jesus uses an agricultural metaphor to help to illustrate the point he's making. A yoke, as we know here, well, that's a harness that goes around animals such as oxen or donkeys or horses. And a yoke ensures that those beasts of burden can pull carts or ploughs, and young oxen will be put alongside a more mature oxen to learn how to actually pull. And whenever the young oxen chose to try to turn off a different way, well, they couldn't, because they were yoked to the mature oxen who was just standing there waiting. So the seasoned ox would wait until the young ox sort of realised he couldn't drag off in a different direction, and then continue. And that way the young ox would learn what it was to actually work and be under the yoke. The two bore the burden together. And when Jesus says, all who are weary and burdened, come to me and I will give you rest, because my yoke is easy, my burden is light. He isn't here talking of physical burdens. He was using that illustration. We're not under a yoke, a physical yoke. Jesus was referring to the heavy burden of the system of works or rules that the Pharisees had laid down on the backs of people. If you look further on in Matthew's Gospel, you will see that Jesus actually rebukes the Pharisees for laying heavy burdens on the shoulders of the people. That's in Matthew 23. See, in the Old Testament, particularly in Leviticus, but a few other bits in Numbers and Deuteronomy and such like, God laid down certain rules or laws for living. That's fine. Those rules were there to recognize and acknowledge God for who he is, to honor and worship him in prescribed ways, and it provided a safe and fair way for communities to live. Think 10 Commandments, don't steal, stuff like that. Sounds sort of rules actually around in all societies. But as time went by, a Jewish group, the Pharisees, interpreted these God-given rules, which are only like this sort of size, and built up hundreds and hundreds of rules upon them. It's like, think like an inverted triangle. You started with a few at the bottom, and the Pharisees made hundreds and hundreds of rules at the top, which they laid down. They were not prescribed by God. And so the yoke of the Pharisees is Jesus' phrase for the burdensome load of self-righteousness and legalistic law-keeping required by the Pharisees. The Message version puts it this way. Thank you, Amy. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I love that phrase. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. It's been said by biblical scholars that the Pharisees had over 600 regulations defining what qualified as working on the Sabbath. 600. Can you remember there was one Pharisee actually who came to Jesus and asked about which commandment of the law he had to keep. And you can almost read between the lines with this question, what law of all the laws do I absolutely have to keep? This is a Pharisee asking Jesus, because it was laid down with so many burdens of their own creation. Jesus was saying that any kind of law keeping is a burden. I struggle to keep laws. Most of us struggle to keep laws. Hands up if we never break the speed limit. Matthew, because Matthew's never driven a car yet. Right, okay, yes. Thank you, Matthew. Maybe quick mind there, yes. Is it because keeping laws is a heavy burden. No amount of law keeping will bridge the gap between our sin and getting close to God, God's holiness. Paul states it in Romans 3:20, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. The good news is that Jesus promises to all of us, all who come to him, that he will give us rest from that burden of trying to keep the laws to earn our way into heaven, and rest from that yoke of self-righteousness and legalism prescribed by the Pharisees. Now, the first century Jews were genuinely good people seeking to please the Lord. They tried to live in accordance with the way that they were prescribed. But the huge load laid down by the Pharisees of all these man-made rules was just wearing them down. Anyone who didn't keep their rules could be shamed. They could be cast out of the synagogues and ostracized from community if they didn't measure up. And that was damning. In those days, that would have been damning, being ostracized from your community. So Jesus encourages those who are heavy laden to take the yoke upon them and to find rest, for us to find rest. The yoke is meant to be light and easy because it's a yoke of repentance, of saying sorry, and a yoke of faith, trusting in the Lord. Commitment then to follow Jesus. As the Apostle John says, this is love for God, to obey his commands, and his commands are not burdensome. Jesus died on the cross for us, out of obedience to the Father and to fulfill prophecy. Think Isaiah 53, for example. He has done the hard work of carrying our burden, the burden of our sin, so that that's what we were meant to carry. So our yoke is light because he's carrying it for us. Now that's a very brief scriptural unpacking of that passage. The question is, what does all this mean for us now? Excuse me. Well, when we become a disciple, a follower, an apprentice of Jesus, John Mark Comer, who is the author of this book, suggests we try to organise and simplify our lives along three basic goals. You would have heard these before. To be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do what Jesus did. Who remembers the old WWJD bracelets? What would Jesus do? Yep, okay. Who's still got one? Well done, yes, okay. Well, it sounds easy, doesn't it? Do what Jesus did, fine, just do that. Well, I think we have a problem, or probably more than one problem. Often, we're too busy rushing around from one urgent task to yet another urgent task, to yet another task, to find time for Jesus. We live busy lives. This is particularly true if you're raising a young family, if you're in a high-pressure job of some sort, or maybe you're caring for elderly relatives or parents who perhaps place a great demand on you. And I'm sure nearly all of us can relate to being in one or more of those situations at one time, or maybe more than one time. I know I can. Or maybe perhaps we're at a slightly gentler season of our lives. Probably put myself in this category. But we still find quite enough stuff to keep us occupied, thank you very much. Some of it important, some of it less so. And somehow having a loving and meaningful relationship with Jesus doesn't always make it to the top tier of our priorities. There's perhaps something a little bit more interesting or exciting or novel or different to do apart from following Jesus. Or maybe we are anxious about something. We're being dragged down by health problems or money problems or family relationships. And it's distracting so much that it's pulling us away from Jesus. And what does Jesus say to all of these problems? Come to me, all who are wearied. You're wearied with raising a young family. You're wearied at work. You're wearied looking after your old parents. You're wearied trying to make the ends meet at the end of the month. You're wearied because your health isn't as it was. Because he loves you. Come to me, he says, because he loves you and he's for you. Who remembers the song, The Blessing, which we did in lockdown and we sing here now and again? Great song. And what line is repeated so much in that song? He is for you. He is for you. He is for you. He is for you. He is for each one of us. He's on your side. Thank you. He's on your side. So our challenge, thank you, Amy, is our priorities. No matter what the problems or distractions may be. And I couldn't find one that had Jesus up there, and I tried to sort of stick Jesus over the line, saying life there, but I couldn't. So that's one that doesn't have Jesus in, but that list of stuff that often distracts us. I believe our priorities, now you may disagree with these priorities, but I believe our priorities are, first of all, our relationship with Jesus, with God, because this affects, quite frankly, our eternal destiny. And nothing is more important than that. And when we get our relationship with Jesus sorted out, then we often find that all the other problems we have will sort themselves out in their own time, once you get the number one done. The next priority, I believe, is our family. Whatever form that takes. It can be your family, your spouse, husband, wife. It can be children. It can be parents. It can be siblings. It can be other close relatives. Maybe if you don't have a physical family, a biological family, you have very, very close friends who mean so much to you. They are effectively family. And we also have our health as well. Things that are important to us, that really matter to us. I then think our next priority is things like church. Sorry, Jeanette. I think church comes below family. Church, Jesus at the top, family, church. Jeanette's nodding. I've got the okay, the vicar? That's good. Our job, our house, perhaps our car, our charitable giving, all the sort of key stuff in our life, but not quite as important. All those things that support us to enable us to do the higher priorities. And then, the last of all, the other priorities are all the other stuff we have in our lives. our shopping, our TV we watch, the video games we play, the sport, our social activities, our pastimes, our hobbies, our social engagements, whatever it is, that I think is the order. Now you may disagree. You may disagree with that, that's fine. That's what I think the order should be. But when we sort our priorities out so Jesus is first, then things start to line up afterwards. So we then have to ask the question, how can I live so that I am in step with Jesus? Think of those oxen working together, Jesus and you. It's no good trying to rush off and do something different. You have to work at Jesus' pace, not our pace. Well, if you remember the Message version, thank you, right, that talks about this, how we can actually line it up. The unforced rhythms of grace, that phrase used. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live lightly and freely. Now, John Mark Comer has suggested several practices we may like to adopt, and I just want to look at two now, just two, that Jesus demonstrated, and see how to apply these in our lives. Those two are Sabbath and silence and solitude, just two practices for us to consider. So Sabbath. Now the Sabbath word comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat and means to stop. To stop working, to stop wanting, to stop worrying, to just stop. We live in a world where people can often be described as busy, rushed, distracted, confused, greedy, discontented, worried, anxious, sad, success and achievement driven, a restless, frantic world. Is that a world you can relate to? I can remember relating to that world a lot. Whereas the Sabbath is a restful world, a world described with phrases like slowness, peace, quiet, delight, enjoyment, gratitude, trust, love, joy, a world where we take the time just to enjoy the moment, a restful world, a world at peace. Which one would you rather be in? Right. That we live in the first world, but we need to try to aim for the second one. We need a Sabbath in our lives. Jesus described the purpose of the Sabbath in this excerpt from Mark 2. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created by God. Right at the beginning, in Genesis 2, we see on the seventh day, God rested from his work and blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Now, just to avoid any confusion, God didn't need to rest because he is tired, okay? God is God, he does not get tired. He rested to show us what to do. He was setting an example. In a way, he was building a rhythm into the DNA of creation. And if we try to work against that rhythm, we'll have problems. To use a carpentry metaphor, if you work against the grain, you will get splinters. God considered the Sabbath to be so important that he commanded us to have a Sabbath in his 10 Commandments, number 4. Now, I said the Sabbath comes from the Hebrew Shabbat, and it means stop. John Mark Comer also says it means the word delight. So Sabbath is a day to stop and a day to delight. To delight in creation. To delight in our lives within creation. To delight in the God who created all that we have. And to delight in God himself. So we stop. We rest from our labours. We rest our bodies. We rest our emotions, and we rest our souls. But the Sabbath is not a day off. Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message version of the Bible, uses this phrase. I'm tempted to read out what he called it, but I think it's rather earthly language, so I'll skip the first bit. He calls it the illegitimate child. Think another word for an illegitimate child. The illegitimate child of the seventh day and Western culture. On a day off, you don't work for your employer, in theory. You still work. You run errands. You catch up around your house or apartment, pay the bills, make an IKEA run, or go shopping in some way. That's 4 hours gone to IKEA. Who's done that? Yes, we all know that, don't we? Yes. And you play. You see a movie, you kick the soccer ball around with friends, you go shopping, you go for a cycle ride, you go for a walk, and that's all great stuff. All of it. I love it. But those activities don't make a Sabbath. A day off is not the Sabbath. I'm not really looking at the vicar now. Right. We have 6 days to do all that stuff, okay? 1 day to rest and to delight in God. Now, which day you take off as your Sabbath depends on your circumstances. I guess for most of us, we would probably say that today, the Sunday, is our Sabbath. But others, Sunday is a busy day, and so another day is needed. Jeanette has a Monday off. I hope Monday is a day off for a Sabbath and not a day off to do all the jobs you haven't got done in the week. Right. But the idea is, on the Sabbath, we take a rest from our weekly chores, our work, our to-do lists, our shopping, and we rest and we delight. Now, do you think this is something that you could do? To set aside 1 day a week, which is truly different. John Mark Comer describes how his Sabbath, when he was raising his family, was significantly different. They do things like they put their mobile phones in a drawer and don't touch them for 24 hours. Hey, that would be a challenge for a start. Yes, withdrawal symptoms would come after a few minutes, wouldn't they? But it's actually, that's the way that he interpreted it. It's good read this book. It's very light, very easy to read. Could we set aside a day that was truly different to rest and enjoy and delight in the Lord? That's the Sabbath. Next one. Thank you, Amy. Silence and solitude. Thank you, Amy. Now, we live in a modern technological world where it is far, far too easy to be distracted in the form of digital media. You are now distracted by the pictures I put up there, which is good in a way, because I'm trying to illustrate this. We live, we default to this so often, don't we? Maybe not our generation, but for a lot of people, they default to this when they've got a moment to spare. When we have a few minutes or two, or a spare hour or two, what do we do? What's our default activity? Perhaps we find it far too easy to find things that will keep us occupied and avoid us having to be alone with our thoughts. There are so many social networks out there that we can log into if we choose to, that can keep us occupied for hours. I think it's called doom scrolling, is the phrase that's used. Now, I could try to be all sort of holier than thou and say, well, I'm not on Facebook or Instagram. But Sally is so I sort of look over her shoulder now and again. So I can't say I'm at all sorted. But often we will find things that will keep us occupied. I'm like that. I very rarely sit down and do nothing. I'm always keeping myself occupied somehow. But of course, when we're living in a distracted world, whether it's something we want to do like a hobby or doom scrolling, we're not living in the real world. See, the real world is the one occupied by God, by other people, by the beauty of creation, and even by our own souls. And the noise of the modern world can make us deaf to the voice of God, drowning out the one input we need most. Now, when we read the Gospels, you will find many, many times when Jesus deliberately retreated from his ministry to spend time with the Father. He started his ministry after a spell of 40 days in the desert, starving, no food, 40 days, after which he was accosted by the devil, who tried to tempt him away. We know that, accosted 3 times. Now, Jesus was clearly physically weak after 40 days without food, but spiritually, he was super strong enough to easily face up to the devil and walk away untouched. Score, Jesus 3, devil 0. Okay. Jesus used the silence and the solitude of the desert to charge his spiritual batteries, to prepare him for his ministry. And if you read through the Gospels, you'll see Jesus was always going off, whether it was first thing in the morning, after a busy day, he would go off onto a mountainside, somewhere quiet and alone without the disciples. He would go off and spend time in prayer and in solitude. He sought silence to be alone with the Father, so he could recharge himself. And throughout history, church leaders and teachers have agreed that silence and solitude are crucial to us growing closer to Jesus. Henry Nouwen, he was a Catholic priest and teacher of the last century, said bluntly, "We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to him." So how can we introduce a rhythm of silence and solitude into our busy, distracted lives? Well, John Mark Comer has suggested a way that works for him. Now, you and me already be able to have a period of silence and solitude, and in which case I take my hat off to you, because I don't find it easy. If you found a way that works for you where you can be alone with the Lord, then that's great. Well, the first thing you've got to do, if you want to spend time alone with the Lord, is to make a commitment. It sounds daft, so it will take effort. You've got to say, yes, I want to do this. It takes determination. We then need to find a quiet place, John Mark Comer suggests. It could be indoors or outdoors, whatever suits you, but a place generally where you're going to be alone. Now, alone doesn't mean isolated. Alone means simply you could be alone with your thoughts. Take time. Start small. If you can manage a few minutes of peace and quiet, that's good. Longer maybe comes with practice. I'm very definitely working on this one. John Mark Comer then suggests slow down, come into the present, and let your emotions come to the surface, the good and the bad ones. Don't suppress your feelings or your thoughts, give them to the Lord. Don't hide stuff. I mean, you can't hide stuff from the Lord anyway, but don't hide stuff. Let it come up, let it bubble up, and just give it to the Lord. And then listen. Listen, listen, listen. God will talk to you. We just have to listen for his still, small voice amongst the noise of our lives. Now, you've heard a lot about mindfulness. Mindfulness is fine. It's simply silence and solitude for a secular society. It's the same thing, but it's just missing the best part, Jesus. We even call it prayer or meditation or contemplation. So mindfulness is fine, but add in Jesus and you've got a winning team there. Now, if silence and solitude was good enough for Jesus, and he exemplified that, and I reckon it's good enough for us. But our challenge, and I know my challenge, is to make the effort to deliberately turn away from all the stuff that distracts us, whether it's we have to do it or whether we want to do it, and to spend time with Jesus. Just chatting to him, being with him. It's a simple practice. It only just takes 5 minutes a day. Thank you, Amy. So, to conclude, as I said, the aim of my talk is to help us see that following Jesus is not meant to be a slog. It's not difficult. It's meant to be a light burden, but at times challenging. And when we align the way that we do things with the way that Jesus did things, we find that being a follower, a disciple, and an apprentice of Jesus is not an onerous task, but we have to align how we do things with the way Jesus does things. And I hope you've picked up that I've suggested 2 simple practices that we can follow that will help us draw closer to God, be more in step with him. Having time for a Sabbath and spending time in solitude and silence. Our challenge, as always, is to go and do as Jesus did. Are you up for it? Thank you.